Well, I'm finally getting around to it. Let's talk about the 2022 CFL Free Agent Frenzy when it comes to my Calgary Stampeders, as well as we'll take a look around the league, as I've done every year at this time. Hi there, it's Brett Hornby here, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. And here we are in about the mid to late February in the 2022 season, or off season for the Canadian Football League. Well, the CFL Free Agent Frenzy began officially on Tuesday, February the 8th, where players were also able to have a courting period a week before the February 8th date to look at possibly playing elsewhere, and definitely was more interesting this season when you look around the league on some big names that have moved around and a couple of big names from the past that have returned as they moved on to do other things because of the 2020 season not happening and the shortened season last season. So we'll take a look at that in this video. Who did my Calgary Stampeders pick up? Or I'm also going to say, more importantly, who we kept. And then we'll take a look at which big names are going around in the CFL. So before I pull out the looking over who was available for my Calgary Stampeders and the rest of the league and who moved around, if you want to follow along with this Calgary sports fans journey home to Flames, Hitmen, Roughnecks, and Stampeders, just make sure you hit like, subscribe. I also do talk Calgary sports on my YouTube channel where we recap games and stories and that, but I also do a variety of non-sports content when I have time, like personal vlogs, attempt to comedy, I also do share experience on the road or a sporting event, and I've done some vlogging to go. And of course I got my second channel in Brett Hornby Shorts, where I exclusively put my short form content on there. So I appreciate like, subscribe both here on my main channel as well as my second channel. So bring out the free agent list for the Calgary Stampeders. I'd first say, before we go over the players, I'm going to say the biggest storylines that the Calgary Stampeders made was what they did before Free Agent Frenzy. I'm going to say mostly in terms of re-signing Reggie Begelton, Trey Oberson, as well as getting Kadeem Carey back. And then, of course, signing Jake Maier and Bo Levi Mitchell, restructuring his contract. So I think those are the big news that Calgary made before free agency began. But in terms of a big trade that the Calgary Stampeders made, I'm going to say their biggest acquisition was ahead of Free Agent Frenzy the weekend before. The Calgary Stampeders made another trade with the Toronto Argonauts in the offseason. The Calgary Stampeders traded defensive back Royce Metchie to the Toronto Argonauts, and in exchange we got a defensive linebacker in Cameron Judge. So I'm going to say that is the biggest acquisition that the Calgary Stampeders made before Free Agent Frenzy via the trade route. But basically, ever since John Hufnagel has run the Calgary Stampeders, he's not really big on going after the big fish in Free Agent Frenzy. He mostly likes to get his internal business done ahead of Free Agent Frenzy. This year was definitely no exception. So looking at the Calgary Stampeders, who was available, well, it actually was worked out that most of the league, one-year contracts, were free agents. So Marquis Ambles, one receiver that was available for the Calgary Stampeders, as well as defensive back Doron Carter, and wide receiver Reggie Begelton, and running back Kadeem Carey. So first, when it comes to Marquis Ambles, he did actually sign with the Toronto Argonauts. So Toronto Argonauts, they seem like former Calgary Stampeders. Then Doron Carter, at first that said I thought he retired, but he also did sign with the Toronto Argonauts. And then, as mentioned in the opening, Reggie Begelton and Kadeem Carey, they both got re-signed here in Calgary before they hit the market, which I'm going to say that was big, because I'm going to say Reggie Begelton would have been one of the top receivers that was available for any CFL team, and Kadeem Carey being the top running back that was available. Even CFL.ca had him touted as the top running back, so I think we did well in keeping them. And then it was long snapper Aaron Crawford, who we picked up from Hamilton last year. He is still available so we haven't signed him yet, but he has not signed elsewhere in the league as of this recording. And then defensive lineman Vincent Desjardins, the defensive lineman from Laval, who played at Laval, he actually signed closer to home, as he did sign with the Montreal Alouettes. And then defensive back Brandon Dozier, he did resign with the Calgary Stampeders before free agency began. And then linebacker Corey Greenwood, I personally think he is probably going to retire. He is still available, but he was pondering retirement after the 2019 season. And then I think with the season that didn't have in 2020, it rejuvenated him. So I would be surprised if Corey Greenwood both is either back with the Calgary Stampeders or playing elsewhere, because he was pondering retirement a couple years ago. And then other big signings that Calgary had was we kept wide receiver in Colton Hunchuk, a local that played with the Colts as well, the Calgary Colts. And then Kamar Jordan, that's another big receiver that the Calgary Stampeders were able to keep, as we did re-sign him before free agent frenzy, but then there was a couple players that obviously went elsewhere due to salary cap constraints, which I'm going to still say to sum up, the Calgary Stampeders signed the players that they absolutely had to sign, in my mind. The players that are still available, well, Neil Cascati, he's actually still available on the offensive line, as well as one of our backup running back in William Longley. He's also available. So he has not signed with Calgary, but is still available with the Calgary Stampeders or the rest of the league. And then offensive lineman and Justin Lawrence. Well, he signed with the Toronto Argonauts as well. And then we did decide to keep Sean Lemon, defensive linebacker, who did hit the market, but he did sign with the Calgary Stampeders. And then defensive back a couple years ago that we picked up in free agent frenzy before, everything got canceled, in Richard Leonard. Well, he's actually going back to the Hamilton Tiger Cats. That's where originally he played before we signed him. So Richard Leonard's going back to Hamilton. And then, as mentioned, we did sign Jake Mayers to be the backup quarterback for the Calgary Stampeders, because there was some possibility that maybe he would have tested the market, thinking maybe he had an opportunity to get more playing time elsewhere. But I'm glad we were able to keep him, just to have that depth, that proven depth that we saw from Jake Mayer last season when Bo was down, and maybe also to have some competition depending on how well Bo does this upcoming season. He's still signed for this year, talking about Bo, but he could be a free agent next season for next year's frenzy. And then we lost wide receiver in Hergy Mayala, as he did sign with the Montreal Alouettes. Another player that I think is probably eventually going to retire. He actually came out of retirement and surprisingly signed with Calgary as fullback in Calvin McCarty after he played like a dozen seasons with Edmonton. So I think Calvin McCarty is probably going to retire. Calgary was able to lock up offensive lineman and Sean McEwen, the All-Star, local from here. He was the big signing that the Calgary Stampeders picked up 2 seasons ago, so it's good that we got him back. And then Royce Mechie, that's the player that I mentioned that we traded to the Toronto Argonauts ahead of free agent frenzy to get Cameron Judge, that we had signed. And Cameron Judge, you might remember him, he played not only with the Toronto Argonauts, but he did start his career with the Saskatchewan Roughriders. And it mentions here that Ante Milojevic Leader, the running back, it says on the CFL that he's still available, but as I know, he actually did sign with the Edmonton Elks, so he is going on the other side of the rivalry in the Battle of Alberta. And then Calgary did sign Jonathan Moxley, defensive back. That might make Cody Fajardo cringe, but I'm glad that Jonathan Moxley is back. And then the Calgary Stampeders last season, we did sign quarterback Michael O'Connor, the Canadian who played at the UBC. Well, he hit the market and he did sign with the BC Lions, says it was a homecoming for him. So Michael O'Connor has moved on, but Calgary did sign a quarterback in Tommy Stevens after when we restructured with Bo Levi Mitchell and Jake Mayer. And then we did decide to keep defensive linebacker in Florian Olamande. Hopefully he can spend less time injured, as well as kicker Rennie Paredes. We also had kicker Ronald Pfeiffer, who was on the practice roster for most of the season. He's still available. And then as well, we did keep Charlie Power, the running back, and we also kept Mike Rose, the defensive lineman. And then another big loss that the Calgary Stampeders had, which I'm going to say salary cap constraints, and maybe that's one of the reasons why we traded to get Cameron Judge, is last year's tackle leader in Darnell Sankey. Well, he signed with the Saskatchewan Roughriders, so be interesting to see how that goes. And then offensive lineman Ryan Sevier, the local, well, he did resign with the Calgary Stampeders, as well as receiver in Richard Sindani. So despite the fact that we still was able to keep Reggie Bagleton and Kamar Jordan, we did lose Marquis Ambles. Although we kept Colton Hutchuk and Richard Sindani for depth, but once you look at the other additions, we might find some other replacements for Marquis Ambles. And then we also re-signed linebacker in Fraser Sopik. So he's coming back. Other players that are still available that I haven't signed to Calgary but still haven't signed elsewhere is Nicholas Stats, the defensive back, as well as running back in Rock Thomas. Calgary Stampeders did keep Jameer Thurman ahead of free agent frenzy. Our defensive back Jamar Wall, he spent his whole time with the Calgary Stampeders. He has not signed yet, but he's still available. Be interested if he could still come back. And then we did decide to keep Derek Wiggin, the defensive lineman. And then Brandon Wilds is still available. And then we did extend Zach Williams, the offensive lineman, for Calgary. And then the last two players on the Calgary Stampeders that were free agents, we lost Cumbry Williams, the offensive lineman, which will sting a little. He did sign with the Ottawa RedBlacks. And then Raheem Wilson, we extended him just before free agent frenzy for the defensive backs. So those are all the free agents that the Calgary Stampeders had going in. I'm going to say we re-signed all the players that we needed to re-sign ahead of free agent frenzy. So then there was a couple players we lost, but it seems that the Calgary Stampeders always find ways to replenish it, either with smaller signings when free agent hits, or of course there's the Canadian College draft that will come on May the 3rd. So I'll make a video on that when that time comes. So now if we take a look at around the league, who's moving elsewhere, other big names that are going elsewhere. There's definitely been some interesting names that are going elsewhere. So starting with the BC Lions, they definitely have made a lot of additions because they missed the playoffs last year. Well, BC, they were able to, I think they have their kicker situation solidified as they have signed Sean White from the Edmonton Elks. So Sean White is going to the BC Lions. And then they also signed defensive back and Lucius Purifoy from the Saskatchewan Roughriders. And I also mentioned Michael O'Connor, who was here last year. He is going to the BC Lions. BC is going to go with two Canadian quarterbacks as their tandem next year because they have Nathan O'Rourke. As well as mentioned Mike Riley, he did retire. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes to the BC Lions. That is going to be their quarterback tandem. And then BC was able to keep Delvin Breaux. They did get Raven Menard, defensive lineman from the Montreal Alouettes. They also got defensive lineman in Matthew Betts from the Edmonton Elks. And then they also got Steve Richardson, defensive lineman from the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. And then they got wide receiver Daniel Peterman from the Ottawa RedBlacks. And then they got linebacker Kevin Francis from the Saskatchewan Roughriders, as well as quarterback Isaac Harker from the Saskatchewan Roughriders. And then they got Jamar Gloster, the offensive lineman from the Ottawa RedBlacks, and the defensive lineman Woody Barron from the Montreal Alouettes. That's who's going to the BC Lions. Right now, leaving the BC Lions, well, Adam Corner, the linebacker, is going to Edmonton. And then Hunter Stewart, the offensive lineman, is going to Ottawa, as well as receiver Shaq Johnson. And then J.R. Tevy is going to the defensive lineman, is going to the Hamilton Tiger-Cats. So that's who's coming and going for the BC Lions, as we expect a makeover with the BC Lions, considering they missed the playoffs last season. And I mentioned for the Calgary Stampeders, we did sign Sean Lemon after he hit the market. I'm going to stay still solid sackmaster for the Calgary Stampeders, a long-time veteran who actually, I think he's almost did the Kevin Glenn and played for almost every team, or might have been a property of every team in the CFL at this point. And then we did sign linebacker who apparently did spend some time in school with the University Donalds and D.A. Lama, a linebacker. He did come from the Montreal Alouettes, so we added him. As I mentioned, we kept Charlie Power, the fullback, because he hit the market technically before we signed him. And then the Calgary Stampeders signed a couple players from the Saskatchewan Roughriders. First, defensive back Ili Woika, who signed from Saskatchewan. And then one of the receivers that I think we brought in to potentially replace some of the production from Marquis Ambles is Jordan Williams Lambert, a wide receiver, also signed for the Saskatchewan Roughriders. So the Calgary Stampeders did add a couple players, didn't have much money to spend in free agency. As John Effield said he didn't have enough money to even go to McDonald's. But I'm going to say when it comes to the Calgary Stampeders, they did a lot of their off-season business before free agency, getting the big name signs. So that's how I feel how things worked with the Calgary Stampeders. So now, if we look at who left the Calgary Stampeders, well, more players left. I mentioned Darnell Sankey, defensive lineman, going to Saskatchewan. Michael Connor, quarterback, is going to BC. Conway Williams, still offensive lineman, going to Ottawa. Wide receiver Hergy Mayala going to Montreal. And then Justin Lawrence, the offensive lineman, going to Toronto. So is Deshaun Amos, the defensive back. And then defensive back Richard Leonard, who is going to Hamilton. Who actually used to came from Hamilton when we signed him. Marquis Ambles, the wide receiver, is going to Toronto. And defensive lineman and Vincent Desjardins going to Montreal. And then we did trade Roy Smetchy to the Toronto Argonauts to get Cameron Judge. So that is who left the Calgary Stampeders. So now if we look at the Edmonton Elks, well, the Edmonton Elks, there definitely is a lot of players from Saskatchewan or Saskatchewan connections going to Edmonton because Chris Jones actually is now the head coach and general manager for the Edmonton Elks, as he did spend some time with Saskatchewan in the past. So definitely going to see a lot of players trading sides in this already, and the fact that the Elks missed the playoffs last season, did not win a game at home. Well, Ed Gainey, defensive back, he is going to Edmonton from Saskatchewan. And then they also signed linebacker in Adam Konar from BC. And then the offensive lineman in Mark Cody come from Ottawa. And then they got linebacker in Toby Antiga from the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. And I think one of the biggest signings that has been signed in free agent frenzy is the Edmonton Elks. They signed Kenny Lawler, from the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. And then defensive lineman and McKenna Henry from Saskatchewan. They also got Dion Lacey, the linebacker, from Saskatchewan. They were able to keep Jillian Marshall. Then they signed Stephen Charles, the defensive lineman from the Ottawa RedBlacks. And Edmonton was able to keep Michael Walker, the wide receiver, Trey Hoskins, defensive back, and linebacker Niles Morgan. And then I heard that Ante Milojevic leader, who apparently was close to sign with Calgary, was also ultimately signed with Edmonton. So who's leaving? Well, the fact that they got Kenny Lawler from Winnipeg. Well, Greg Ellingson, the wide receiver, actually is going to Winnipeg, so you can maybe see that swap as a storyline this season. And then Koala Boateng is going to the Ottawa RedBlacks. That's another team that definitely is going to be made over because they missed the playoffs last year. And then defensive lineman in Matthew Betts, he is going to the BC Lions. And then Derek Moncrief is going to the Saskatchewan Roughriders from Edmonton. And then Tremaine Washington, he was the defensive back who has some speed for returns. Well, he is going to the Ottawa RedBlacks because of Devontae Dedmon. As I know, he did sign with the Miami Dolphins in the National Football League. And then they did pick up Dakota Prukop, who, they cut him, and he signed with the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. So that's the players coming and going from the Edmonton Elks. And then the one intriguing player that actually is joining the Edmonton Elks is not listed is Doron Carter. Yes, Doron Carter, Chris Carter's son. He's a polarizing figure. He's a very talented player. And so talented that he did play as a wide receiver, but he also can play defensive back. So Doron Carter is actually signed as a defensive back with the Edmonton Elks. And of course, he did spend some time in Saskatchewan under Chris Jones. So that's another interesting player that's coming back to the CFL this season. I should also mention another player that's coming back to the Calgary Stampeders. I should say the other big signing that we had is we brought back offensive lineman in Derek Dennis, because I know he did sign with Edmonton and then he sat the season out. Then they released him, but Derek Dennis is also coming back to the Calgary Stampeders. So now, if you look at the Saskatchewan Roughriders, well, their biggest signing was getting Darnell Sankey from the Calgary Stampeders linebacker, and then they also got linebacker in Derek Moncrief from Edmonton. They decided to keep Johanna Susana St. John from the offensive line he signed with Saskatchewan, and then they got Wesley Lewis, a wide receiver from Ottawa, to go into Saskatchewan, and they decided to keep Justin Herman Reed. Leaving Saskatchewan, well, definitely a lot of players leaving Saskatchewan for Edmonton, like Eddie Gainey as mentioned. Lucius Purifoy for the BC Lions is going to BC. And then William Powell, the running back, well, he's actually going back to Ottawa, as he did play with the Ottawa RedBlacks before he went to Saskatchewan. There's McKenna Henry, defensive lineman, quite Edmonton. So was Dion Lacey. So Edmonton's definitely got a little bit of a stronger defense via the Saskatchewan Roughriders in my mind. And then Michael Johnson, the defensive lineman, he is going to Hamilton from Saskatchewan. So I'm going to say the Saskatchewan Roughriders defense is going to be a little weaker based on free agent frenzy. Linebacker Cam Francis is going to BC, as well as quarterback Isaac Harker. And then the Calgary Stampeders did sign Eli Buka, defensive back, and wide receiver Jordan Williams Lambert. So I'm going to say the Saskatchewan Roughriders, I'm going to say based on free agency, are definitely going to be look a little weaker on defense in my mind right now, based on free agent frenzy, a lot of them especially going to Edmonton. So the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, a lot like the Calgary Stampeders, they did a lot of their internal business in the off-season, like getting Zach Claro signed, Adam Big Hill, Willie Jefferson. So the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, I think, signed the players that they had to re-sign, but they had only a few additions right now, as they did get Greg Ellingson from the Edmonton Elks, as they lost Kenny Lawler to Edmonton. And then Tycon Glass, the defensive back, he is going to Winnipeg from Montreal. Then they got Brendan Alexander, defensive back. And then they got Dakota Prokop, who the Edmonton Elks released. So that's who's going to Winnipeg. Leaving Winnipeg, well, Kenny Lawler, the big wide receiver, going to Edmonton. And then Toby Tiga, also going to Edmonton. And Andrew Harris, the running back. Well, he is actually going to the Toronto Argonauts, so that's one of the big names going to on the move is Andrew Harris. But I think between the salary cap and the fact that the Winnipeg Blue Bombers have Brady Oliveira as well as Johnny Augustine, he was a little more expendable, if you ask me. But Andrew Harris is going to Toronto. And then Steven Richardson, defensive lineman, going to BC. Darvin Adams, another wide receiver for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, he is going to the Ottawa RedBlacks. And Eldon Darby, defensive back, going to the Hamilton Tiger Cats. I'm going to say the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, despite their defending Grey Cup champions, two-time Grey Cup champions, I'm going to say they kind of took the same approach as the Calgary Stampeders. They made sure they got their big absolute signings done before free agency, but had to make some sacrifices along the way, which I'm going to say Calgary and Winnipeg, I'm going to say, are still fairly strong when it comes to free agent frenzy. BC, the big question mark for them is how things are going to go with Nathan O'Rourke and Michael O'Connor as their two Canadian quarterbacks, with Mike Riley retiring. I'm going to think Edmonton is going to be a little better defensively, while Saskatchewan is going to be a little weaker defensively in my mind. So that's the Western Conference, or the Western Division. When it comes to the Canadian Football League, well, now let's look out east. And there were definitely some interesting names that are changing teams out east, starting with the Hamilton Tiger Cats. Well, Ted Laurent, defensive lineman, and Jamal Roll, they have re-signed with the Hamilton Tiger Cats after they became free agents on the market. And then they also brought back Richard Leonard, defensive back from the Calgary Stampeders. And then they also brought in Michael Johnson from the Saskatchewan Roughriders, who used to start with the Calgary Stampeders. And then they got defensive lineman in J.R. Tawwell from the BC Lions. And then they also got defensive back Alden Darby from the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. Then the Alex Fontana, offensive lineman from Ottawa. And then they also kept David Unger III, the wide receiver that's staying in Hamilton. Keep in mind, a lot of players from Hamilton are going to Ottawa because the Ottawa RedBlacks, they signed Sean Burke as their new general manager. He did spend some time with player development with the Hamilton Tiger-Cats. There's a lot of familiarity names. So the biggest name leaving the Hamilton Tiger-Cats that's going to Ottawa is quarterback Jeremiah Masoli. So he is going to the Ottawa RedBlacks. And actually there was a report that Jeremiah Masoli was either between the Edmonton Elks or the Ottawa RedBlacks, and he ultimately decided to go to the Ottawa RedBlacks. The Edmonton Elks, they're looking to go with Nick Arbuckle as their starting quarterback. And then Jagger Davis, he is going to the Toronto Argonauts, the defensive lineman. So I guess you could say the Toronto Argonauts are going to the Grey Cup. What I mean by that is Jagger Davis, every year he's been in the CFL. That team has gone to the Grey Cup, although he's only been on the right end of it once, because Jagger Davis was the Calgary Stampeder for 3 seasons when he went to the Grey Cup. Finally got it in 2018, and he was in Hamilton the last 2 years. But now he's going to Toronto, and then here's a string of Ottawa RedBlacks who are going from Hamilton to Ottawa. Is Lorenzo Mondin IV, defensive lineman, going to Ottawa. Darius Sirocco, offensive lineman. Running back Jackson Bennett going to Ottawa. And Jalen Ackland, a wide receiver, going to Ottawa. And then it's going to look strange. It's going to be a storyline on Labor Day out east. Well, Brendan Banks, well, he is actually going to the Toronto Argonauts, as apparently him and the Toronto and the Hamilton Tiger-Cats agreed to part ways. So the Toronto Argonauts, they got Andrew Harris and they got Brendan Banks. And then Jeremiah Masoli going to the Ottawa RedBlacks. So the Hamilton Tiger-Cats are going to be definitely going with Dane Evans as quarterback. I'm going to say the Hamilton Tiger-Cats took a little bit of a hit, I'm going to say, in free agency right now. So now when it comes to the Montreal Alouettes, who is coming to Montreal or resign, well, they took Hergy Maela from the Calgary Stampeders. And then they got linebacker Freddie Chigon. He is going from Ottawa to Montreal. And then they kept defensive lineman Michael Wakefield. And then they wound up deciding to keep Trevor Harris after all at quarterback. So they got Trevor Harris and Vernon Adams Jr. And then Vincent Desjardins, defensive lineman from the Calgary Stampeders. So leaving Montreal, well, defensive back Ty Cranston is going to the Ottawa RedBlacks, and then David Menard, defensive lineman, going to BC, and then DJ Lama going to Calgary. Defensive back Patrick Levels, he is going from Montreal to Ottawa, as well as Money Hunter. So Montreal is definitely going to get decimated a little in defense, and one of their top receivers in BJ Cunningham, he is going to Ottawa as well. I think Montreal has a decision between Jake Winneke or DJ Cunningham, and Jake Winneke is the younger receiver for the Montreal Alouettes, and then Tycone Glass, the defensive back, going to Winnipeg, and defensive lineman and Woody Barron to BC. So Montreal, I'm going to say their defense is going to be a little weaker. I'm going to say Ottawa, they better be a much better team next year, because we'll have a long list to talk about who's going to Ottawa, as they definitely appear to be the most improved team in free agency. As I mentioned, they got Jeremiah Masoli from the Hamilton Tiger-Cats. They decided to keep Devon Coleman, defensive lineman. They got William Powell back from the Saskatchewan Roughriders. Then they got defensive lineman Koa Boateng from Edmonton. And then they got Lorenzo Mondin IV from the Hamilton Tiger-Cats. Then they got defensive back Ty Cranston from Montreal. And then they got offensive lineman and Conby Williams from Calgary. And then they got Hunter Stewart, the offensive lineman from BC. And then they got Daragus Carl, offensive lineman from Hamilton. And then they got wide receiver Darvin Adams from Winnipeg. They kept RJ Harris, the wide receiver. So he stayed in Ottawa, hit the mark first. Jackson Bennett, running back, coming from Hamilton. Then they got Levi Noel, the wide receiver from Toronto. And then they got wide receiver Shaq Johnson from BC. And then got Jalen Ackland, wide receiver from Hamilton. And then they got Money Hunter, defensive back from Montreal. And then they got Patrick Levels, defensive back from Montreal. So they're definitely going to be some trash talk now in Ottawa. And then they got Jermaine Washington, defensive back from Edmonton, who has some speed to return, kicks or pick six. I definitely know that from the Labor Day rematch. And then they got BJ Cunningham, wide receiver from the Montreal Alouettes, and then they kept Anton Pernod. And that's who's going to Ottawa. I'm definitely going to say the Ottawa RedBlacks, based on free agency, they definitely are the most improved team, I should say. Well, they definitely were the last in the East last season. So leaving Ottawa, there isn't as many players leaving Ottawa. As offensive line, Mark Code is going to Edmonton. Daniel Peterman, wide receiver, going to BC. Frederick Young, linebacker, going to Montreal. And then Wesley Lewis, wide receiver, going to Saskatchewan. Offensive lineman Stephen Charles going to Edmonton. And then offensive lineman Jamar McCluster going to BC. And then Alex Fortana, the offensive line, going to Hamilton. So that's who's leaving the Ottawa RedBlacks. And then last with the Toronto Argonauts, who is going to Toronto. Well, there's definitely a lot of former Calgary Stampeders. While Jagger Davis, he is going to the Hamilton, from the Hamilton Tiger to Toronto. That's their biggest signing. As well as running back in Andrew Harris from Winnipeg. And then they can sign Justin Owens, defensive lineman, and defensive back Sean Amos from the Calgary Stampeders. And then they got Adrian Tracy back, who actually did spend some time with the Hamilton Tiger Cats. And then they got Marquis Ambles from the Calgary Stampeders. And they mentioned they got Royce Mechie in that Cambridge Judge trade. And then they got Julian McLeod, defensive lineman. They kept him. And then they got Brandon Bakes from the Hamilton Tiger Cats. The only departure that Toronto has that note is leaving is Levi Naval, wide receiver, going to Ottawa. So that is the free agent frenzy for the CFL, looking both at, for the Calgary Stampeders as well as the league as a whole. I mean, 75% of the league going into this offseason, we're free agents, all these one-year contracts, but hopefully there'll be a little more stability as time goes on. But I'm definitely going to say, when I look at free agent frenzy, there's question marks in BC on their logic on right now with their two Canadian quarterbacks in terms of filling in for Mike Riley. I'm going to say Calgary and Winnipeg, I'm going to say did well in the West when it comes to keeping the players that they had to sign going into free agent frenzy. And then I'm going to say that Chris Jones' effects is improving the Edmonton Elks, and I think the defense on the Saskatchewan Roughriders is weaker right now when looking at free agent frenzy, and that's my take out in the West. Out East, well, definitely the Hamilton Tiger Cats are being decimated by the Ottawa RedBlacks with the Sean Burke hiring. I'm going to say the Ottawa RedBlacks definitely look to be the most improved team when it comes to the free agent frenzy out East. I'm going to say Hamilton, I'm going to say, has been the team that's been got it the most. And the Toronto Argonauts added some interesting pieces when it comes to veterans, like the Brandon Banks, for example, and Jagger Davis. And then the Montreal Alouettes, they just look steady. So that's kind of my take right now with free agent frenzy. But, it's all on paper right now. It's a matter of having it all gel. But I'm going to say, what do you think of CFL free agent frenzy this year? What teams do you think have improved the most? Will have more challenges because of free agent frenzy? And did you like what your team did or what this team did? I'm going to say it's going to be interesting to see, but I think the Edmonton Elks and the Ottawa RedBlacks have definitely improved the most, but those are the two teams that missed the playoffs last season. While the BC Lions, I have questions on their approach right now, as they decided to name Nathan O'Rourke as their starter, and they brought in Michael O'Connor to have two Canadian quarterbacks. I think that's the first time that a team has done that since the 1950s, I believe. But then, as I say, I like what Calgary did in terms of keeping the players that they had to keep. I mean, I'm glad that we were able to keep Reggie Bagleton, Troy Oberson. We got Kamar Jordan signed, and then we were able to restructure Bo's contract to get Jake Mayer signed as well, and Kadeem Carey. Those are the players that I was most worried about losing as a Calgary Stampeders fan, and then the fact that we lost a couple players that I think we could afford to lose, but of course we brought in like Jordan Williams, Lambert, Cameron Judge in that trade, and then of course you got the Canadian College draft, which you never know who we could draft that could be that impact player that could be for anywhere in the league right now, but we'll have to wait till May 3rd for that. And I looked it up. I'm not too sure if there's a global draft this year, because there was a global draft last year where you drafted players from elsewhere overseas, but I didn't see any date for that. So if there's that, there'll be other off-season news. But when it comes to any Calgary Stampeders and off-season news, to go subscribe to me if you are interested to follow along this Calgary sports fans journey. So as I say, if you want to follow along this Calgary sports fans journey, home of the Flames, Hitmen, Roughnecks, and Stampeders, just make sure you hit like, subscribe, as I mostly do talk Calgary sports on my YouTube channel, or recapping games and stories. And this video finally got around to recording the CFL Free Agent Frenzy, both what the Calgary Stampeders have done and as well as who's moving around the CFL. But I also do a variety of non-sports content when I'm down, like personal blogs, attempt to comedy, and I also do share my experience time on the road or a sport event. And I also have done some blogging to go in the past. So if that all sounds like be interesting to watch, to follow along with this Calgary sports fans journey, you know what you do, just make sure you hit like, subscribe. I also have my other social links down in the description below, and of course I have my second channel in Brett Hornby Shorts where exclusively put my short form content on that channel, so I appreciate it. Like, subscribe both here on my main channel as well as my second channel. So I'm going to say, go Stamps go, and best of luck to all the players that have changing jerseys. I'm definitely excited on who we brought in, but more importantly, who we kept. It's definitely going to be another fun CFL season. Some storylines, especially, Brandon Banks going to Toronto, or Chris Jones back in Edmonton, taking away some of the Saskatchewan defense. Seeing Doron Carter back in the league. Bring on June and bring on the CFL. I'm definitely looking forward to it this year, so I just want to say thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.